On October 24, 2001 in Conroe, Texas, a crime was committed that would change two young men's lives forever and alter the lives of three families in a way no one could have imagined. Michael Perry and Jason Burkett, both just 19 years old, were caught in a desperate moment of bad choices. They had no future, no real prospects, and no way out. What began as a plan to steal two cars quickly turned into a series of tragic events that left three people dead. The story that unfolded became one of the most haunting cases in Texas history. One man would face the ultimate penalty, death. The other, despite being equally guilty, would spend his life behind bars. Why did the justice system treat these two men so differently? Was it the circumstances? The defense? Or was there something more at play? What made Michael Perry's fate so final, while Jason Burkett's path remained open, if only by a slim chance? This is a case of two men who made the same deadly decisions, but only one paid with his life. How does the justice system come to such a conclusion? And if shocking death row twists like this interest you, feel free to subscribe. I cover real cases that get even more unbelievable than this one. Michael Perry and Jason Burkett's lives were shaped by early hardship, each carrying a history that set them on a path toward violence. For Michael, life had been full of struggles. Adopted into a family that tried to care for him, yet his mental health issues and a lack of stability made it difficult for him to find his place. Diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, ADD, and later conduct disorder, he had spent much of his youth in and out of institutions, bouncing between psychiatric facilities and group homes. Despite his family's best efforts, Michael's frustrations only deepened, and his growing aggression led him into petty crime, which eventually escalated into far more serious offenses. Jason Burkett, like Michael, came from a troubled home. His relationship with his father, Delbert Burkett, was a strained one, filled with emotional neglect and abuse. Delbert's violent nature and the constant turmoil within his home played a significant role in shaping Jason's perception of the world. With little positive influence in his life, Jason became bitter and cynical. The more time passed, the more disconnected he became from society. At the age of 19, Jason found himself lost, a young man full of anger and confusion, looking for a way out of a life he felt was hopeless. The two young men met and quickly became partners in crime, drawn together by their shared experiences of hardship. Michael and Jason's desperation grew as they struggled to find a way out of their difficult circumstances. They viewed the world around them with a sense of entitlement, believing they deserved better, even if it meant taking it by force. Their bond, fueled by frustration and anger, led them to a tragic decision. They would steal cars from a wealthy neighborhood, a seemingly simple crime that would soon spiral into a life-shattering tragedy. While Michael and Jason's world was darkened by their troubled pasts, the lives of Sandra Stoller, her son Adam, and Adam's best friend Jeremy Richardson stood in stark contrast. Sandra, a 50-year-old nurse, had built a life focused on caring for others. She worked hard to support her family, doing everything she could to ensure her son had opportunities for a better future. Adam, just 16, was a bright, compassionate teenager with a deep love for life. His best friend Jeremy was equally optimistic. The two boys shared a strong bond, and their future seemed filled with promise. Sandra's home, a place of warmth and security, stood as an anchor in Adam and Jeremy's lives, offering them a space where they could dream and feel safe. Little did they know that their world would soon be shattered by the arrival of two strangers, Michael and Jason. Sandra, ever the welcoming mother, did what she always did when someone knocked on her door. She offered kindness. Michael and Jason, seeming harmless at first, found refuge in her home, unaware of the irreversible turn their lives were about to take. As Michael and Jason spent time in the Stoller household, their plan was still in motion. The theft of the cars was their goal, but what followed would forever change their lives and the lives of those they encountered. When Adam returned home with Jeremy, the two unsuspecting teens would find themselves drawn into a situation they could never have prepared for. What started as a simple visit quickly escalated into a shocking and irreversible tragedy. Michael and Jason, desperate for something more, had reached a breaking point. They could see the lives they wanted, but they didn't know how to achieve it through anything other than force. In a dark turn of fate, Sandra, Adam, and Jeremy became victims, not by their own fault, but because two young men felt that they were entitled to something that was not theirs. The aftermath would haunt the community, leaving a trail of grief and unanswered questions. The crime was not simply the result of a moment's anger, it was the product of years of frustration, pain, and the absence of support. It was a horrific demonstration of what can happen when troubled young men feel they have no other option, and it would leave a lasting scar on all those involved, from the victims' families to the young men themselves. But what would happen next was even more unsettling. One killer would be sentenced to death, while the other would be given a life sentence without the possibility of parole. What made the difference? How did the justice system decide their fates? This is a case that brings us face to face with the complexity of justice, punishment, and the impact of a troubled past. It's a case that continues to provoke questions even years later. How does the system determine who deserves death and who deserves life? And in a case where both perpetrators were equally culpable, what made one man's fate irreversible, while the other still has time to seek redemption? In the days leading up to October 24, 2001, Michael Perry and Jason Burkett found themselves stuck in a cycle of frustration and hopelessness. Neither had a job, nor any real direction in life. Both were struggling with their own personal demons, each of them trapped by a past they couldn't escape. They turned to petty crime, committing small thefts and engaging in activities that gave them temporary relief from their daily struggles. They needed a way out, something that could bring them a sense of escape from their dismal reality. On October 24th, Michael and Jason decided to escalate their actions. They had their eyes set on a wealthy neighborhood in Conroe, Texas. A place where they believed they could find what they were looking for. Cars that would give them a taste of a life they felt they deserved but could never obtain legally. They had no real plan, but their desperation clouded their judgment. They needed cars and they were willing to take them no matter the cost. It was around late afternoon when they decided to target Sandra Stoller's home. Sandra, a 50-year-old nurse, was a working mother who had spent her life dedicated to caring for others. Her home, like so many others, was a place of sanctuary, not just for her but for her son Adam and his best friend Jeremy. The two young men had no idea that their day would take such a drastic turn when they arrived home later that evening. Michael and Jason knocked on Sandra's door, presenting themselves as two young men looking for help. Sandra, ever the caring and trusting individual, welcomed them inside, thinking they were harmless. Michael and Jason made their intentions clear only after they had gained entry into her home. Initially, their plan was simple. They wanted to steal the keys to a car, a move that would give them a momentary escape from their lives. But as the tension grew, something darker began to unfold. What started as a relatively innocent interaction quickly shifted. Sandra, perhaps sensing that something was wrong, grew uneasy. Michael and Jason's impatience began to show. As Sandra realized their intentions, a calm moment quickly turned into chaos. Within minutes, the situation escalated beyond control. Michael and Jason, driven by a sense of entitlement and anger, resorted to violence. After their initial actions at the house, Michael and Jason left, but not for long. They returned to Sandra's house, this time waiting for her son Adam and his best friend Jeremy. Sandra's family had no idea that danger was lurking just outside. The two boys, Adam and Jeremy, arrived home later that evening, unaware of the peril that awaited them. The two killers had a plan, one that would lead the victims into the woods, a place where they would never make it out. Michael and Jason decided to tell Adam and Jeremy a false story to get them to follow them to a remote location. They told them that they needed help, weaving a tale of car trouble, hoping to lure them into a vulnerable position. Trusting that their intentions were harmless, Adam and Jeremy followed. Once they were in a more isolated part of the area, the situation took an even darker turn. What was supposed to be a moment of help turned into a tragic and irreversible decision. The killers, having already crossed the line, showed no remorse for their actions. Adam and Jeremy were left with no chance to escape, unaware of the final blow that was about to alter the course of their lives forever. The immediate aftermath of the killings revealed the killers' lack of remorse. They didn't panic or express guilt. Instead, they went about their business, showing no signs of concern for what they had just done. Michael and Jason had taken lives, but their focus quickly turned back to their own desires and the next step in their plans. In the span of just a few hours, Michael Perry and Jason Burkett's decision to steal a car had escalated into a tragedy. The impulse and lack of hesitation in their actions were clear. They felt no real consequence for their actions. What they failed to grasp was that the consequences would be felt not just by the families of the victims but by themselves as well. The horror of that night would haunt the community, leaving everyone to question the depth of their desperation, the choices they made, and the lives they shattered. The investigation into the tragic events of October 24, 2001, began almost immediately after the crimes occurred. In the aftermath, the police in Conroe, Texas, worked quickly to connect the crime scene to the perpetrators. What seemed at first to be a simple theft turned into a much larger and more disturbing case. The search for answers would lead investigators to uncover details that would shed light on the motivations of the two young men responsible, Michael Perry and Jason Burkett. The first significant lead came when authorities discovered a stolen car linked to the victims. The Camaro was found abandoned not far from the scene, a key piece of evidence that led the investigation forward. This car was soon tied to Michael Perry, who had taken the vehicle after committing the crimes. It was one of the earliest signs that Perry and Burkett were connected to the killings, though at that point, the full scope of their actions wasn't clear. Further investigation revealed more disturbing clues. Among the victims' personal belongings, the police found Adam Stoller's wallet, which was in Michael Perry's possession. This was one of the most significant discoveries, linking Perry directly to the scene. The wallet contained items that could only have come from Adam, and it left no doubt about Perry's involvement. The discovery of the wallet was crucial to understanding the crime and connecting the two killers to the events of that night. In addition to the wallet, the police quickly turned to forensic evidence to strengthen their case. DNA samples were collected from the crime scene, and testing revealed a match to Michael Perry. His DNA was found at the location, further confirming that he had been there. The forensic team also worked closely to establish the timeline of the killings through the examination of the victims' bodies. They were able to determine when the victims had died, providing vital information that allowed investigators to piece together the events of the evening. The investigation took a pivotal turn when Michael Perry was arrested. After being pulled over for a traffic violation, officers discovered items in his car that connected him to the crime. Perry was taken into custody, and during questioning he confessed to his involvement in the murders. He described how he and Jason Burkett had planned to steal cars but had escalated their actions after meeting Sandra Stoller. According to Perry's confession, the situation spiraled quickly, leading to the killings. While his confession was significant, it also led investigators to Burkett, who had been involved in the crimes from the start. Burkett's role became clearer as the investigation unfolded. Although he initially denied his involvement, further evidence and a detailed confession from Perry helped to piece together his part in the crime. Jason eventually admitted his involvement, explaining how, like Michael, he had been swept up in the events. His confession detailed how they had lured Adam and Jeremy to a more remote area before the crimes occurred. The pieces of the puzzle began to come together, with both men admitting their roles. As the investigation continued, the autopsy findings provided additional clarity on the timeline of the victims' deaths. The medical examiners were able to pinpoint the time of death for each victim, providing key details that corroborated the confessions and forensic evidence. The investigators used this information to further verify their understanding of the events, solidifying the case against Perry and Burkett. The forensic evidence, combined with the confessions and the items recovered from the scene, painted a clear picture of what had happened that night. Michael Perry and Jason Burkett's actions were no longer just a matter of speculation. The investigation had connected them directly to the crime, and the evidence was undeniable. However, the deeper questions remained: what drove two young men to commit such heinous acts? And why did one face the ultimate punishment while the other received a different fate? This investigation not only revealed the shocking details of the crime but also raised important questions about justice and responsibility. As the evidence mounted, It became clear that the consequences of Michael and Jason's actions would ripple through their lives and the lives of those around them for years to come. The case had only just begun to unfold in the public eye, and the answers to these questions would continue to shape the ongoing discussion around justice, crime, and punishment in the years that followed. The trials of Michael Perry and Jason Burkett marked a turning point in the lives of both the accused and their victims' families, as well as in the legal discussions surrounding juvenile justice. When their day in court arrived, it was clear that the outcome would not only affect the men standing trial but would also stir larger debates about punishment and redemption. Michael Perry's trial was intense. The confession he made to the police played a pivotal role in the case. In it, Perry admitted to his involvement in the deaths of Sandra Stoller, Adam, and Jeremy. He described how, during the robbery that spiraled out of control, things had escalated far beyond his expectations. While the confession was key, Perry's defense team argued that his statement had been coerced under pressure, claiming that Perry, struggling with his mental health, had been emotionally vulnerable during the interrogation. They pointed to his past struggles with mental illness and trauma as factors that should have been considered when evaluating his state of mind at the time. The prosecution, on the other hand, painted a very different picture. They focused on the forensic evidence that tied Perry directly to the crime scene. DNA found at the location of the murders matched Perry's, and the items discovered in his possession, including Adam's wallet, were undeniable pieces of evidence linking him to the crime. The prosecution also emphasized Perry's behavior after the killings, noting that he had shown no visible remorse. This lack of empathy added to the case against him, painting a picture of someone who had committed these actions without regard for the consequences. After deliberating, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Michael Perry was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. The sentence was swift, as the evidence against him was overwhelming. His confession, coupled with the forensic findings and the lack of emotional response following the crime, led the jury to conclude that the death penalty was the appropriate punishment. In contrast, Jason Burkett's trial took a different turn. His defense team took a more empathetic approach, arguing that his actions were influenced by his abusive upbringing. Jason's father, Delbert Burkett, took the stand to testify about the difficult and violent environment in which Jason was raised. Delbert painted a picture of a young boy who had been physically and emotionally mistreated, creating a complicated backdrop for Jason's actions. His defense argued that the trauma of his childhood had played a significant role in shaping the decisions he made as an adult. The prosecution, while acknowledging Jason's difficult upbringing, pointed to his involvement in the same crime as Michael Perry. They argued that, despite his past, Jason should still be held accountable for his actions. However, the emotional testimony from his father seemed to resonate with the jury. Delbert's plea for mercy was heard by those who deliberated his son's fate, and the jury ultimately recommended a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The stark differences in their sentences raised questions about the factors influencing the justice system's decisions in cases involving young offenders. Michael Perry and Jason Burkett were both responsible for the same crime, yet the court had decided that Perry should pay with his life, while Jason would serve life in prison. Was it the coldness of Perry's demeanor and his lack of remorse that led to the harsher sentence? Or was it the emotional testimony surrounding Burkett's background that ultimately shaped his fate? These are questions that still linger in the minds of many. Both trials sparked intense debate about the role of juvenile sentencing, particularly in cases where the offenders are young adults. The issue of how much weight should be given to childhood trauma versus the severity of the crime was central to Jason's case, while Michael's trial focused on the impact of his lack of remorse and his violent actions. These cases also raised important discussions about mental health and whether young individuals who commit such serious offenses should be treated differently from adults. The legal strategies employed in both trials highlighted the complexities of the justice system when it comes to young offenders. The emotional testimony in Burkett's case contrasted sharply with the more clinical approach taken in Perry's. Both men were ultimately found guilty, but the justice system's response to their actions varied greatly. As the trials concluded and the sentences were handed down, the community and the families involved were left grappling with the aftermath. The deaths of Sandra, Adam, and Jeremy were irreplaceable, and the lives of Michael and Jason would forever be shaped by the choices they made that fateful night. The court's decisions, while final, did not answer all the questions about justice, responsibility, and the impact of a troubled upbringing. What remained was a lingering sense of uncertainty about how much the past shapes the present, and how society should respond when young lives are marked by both trauma and violence. After Michael Perry and Jason Burkett's trials concluded, the aftermath unfolded with significant public and legal consequences. The decisions regarding their sentences stirred national conversations about justice, punishment, and the future of young offenders within the criminal justice system. On July 1, 2010, Michael Perry was executed in Texas after years of appeals. Despite challenges to his conviction, including questions around the fairness of his trial and his mental health, Perry's execution went ahead. His case had been mired in controversy, with many arguing that he had been denied the proper consideration of his troubled background and psychological issues. Perry's execution, however, remained the final chapter of his involvement in the crime. For Lisa Ballon, Sandra Stoller's daughter, Michael's execution did not bring peace. The years of grief and loss caused by his actions could not be erased by the legal outcome. Lisa had struggled with the trauma of losing her mother and brother, and while the execution symbolized closure for some, for her, it was simply the final act in a painful story that no verdict could heal. Lisa, in interviews, stated that while the punishment was deserved, the execution did not undo the void that had been left in her life. Meanwhile, Jason Burkett faced a life sentence without the possibility of parole. His fate was different from Michael's, but it too sparked heated debates. Some argued that his childhood trauma, raised in an abusive household, had influenced his criminal actions and that he should have been shown leniency. Others, however, felt his punishment was too light, considering the severity of the crime. The discussion surrounding his sentence became part of the broader conversation about juvenile justice, particularly in cases involving young adults with troubled backgrounds. Jason's case raised important questions about how the justice system treats those who commit serious crimes but have a history of hardship and abuse. Should their past be considered when determining the sentence, or should the severity of their actions be the only factor? Public opinion was divided on this issue, with some believing that Jason's life sentence was appropriate, while others felt it was too lenient. One of the most poignant aspects of the case came with the release of Werner Herzog's documentary, Into the Abyss. Herzog, known for his deep and often haunting explorations of human nature, took a closer look at the events surrounding Michael Perry's death row experience. The film captured Perry's final days, offering an intimate portrayal of the emotional toll of capital punishment. The documentary questioned the fairness of the death penalty, especially in cases involving young offenders. Through interviews with those connected to the case, including Perry's last words, the documentary raised uncomfortable questions about the morality of executing someone who had committed a crime at such a young age. The documentary also touched on the moral implications of the death penalty in juvenile sentencing, making a broader statement about the criminal justice system. The case, with its tragic loss of life and the contrasting fates of Perry and Burkett, reignited debates about whether capital punishment should still be used, particularly for those who committed their crimes while still in their teens. The film encouraged viewers to reflect on the choices made by both the victims' families and the legal system, challenging assumptions about justice and punishment. As the case continued to resonate in the public sphere, the conversations around juvenile justice and the death penalty deepened. The case of Michael Perry and Jason Burkett prompted calls for reform, with advocacy groups pushing for changes in how young offenders are treated in the justice system. The tragic events highlighted a larger issue. Can a young person shaped by a history of trauma and violence be held fully responsible for their actions, or should their background be a factor in their punishment? Over time, Michael Perry's execution and Jason Burkett's life sentence became a case study in the complexities of justice, redemption, and accountability. While Michael's death may have provided a sense of closure for some, it did little to change the underlying questions about the fairness of the justice system. For others, Jason's sentence seemed to highlight the need for more compassionate approaches to young offenders, particularly those whose past experiences shaped their actions. The case left a deep imprint on the community, sparking national conversations about the limits of punishment and the possibility of rehabilitation. It was not just a story of crime and punishment. It was a reminder that the system often grapples with how to balance the past of an offender with the need for justice for the victims. In the years since, the legacy of this case has lived on, not just in the lives of the families affected but in the broader societal conversations it helped to fuel. How the justice system deals with youth crime, particularly with those who have been deeply affected by their upbringing, remains a topic that continues to challenge lawmakers, legal professionals, and the public alike. As the story of Michael Perry and Jason Burkett draws to a close, the case continues to raise difficult questions about justice, the effects of childhood trauma, and how the legal system should handle young offenders. Their actions were irreversible, leaving families broken and a community forever impacted. Yet their fate, one sentenced to death and the other to life in prison, remains controversial, sparking debates that continue to resonate. The question that lingers is whether childhood trauma can ever truly explain or justify such actions. Michael Perry's history, marked by emotional struggles and a lack of support, played a role in his decision-making, but it was not seen as enough to lessen his responsibility. On the other hand, Jason Burkett's defense emphasized the abuse he suffered and the difficult environment that shaped his choices. But how much does a person's past matter when weighed against the crime they commit? Does it offer any mitigation, or should the severity of the act be the sole factor in their punishment? For Sandra Stoller's daughter, Lisa Ballon, the execution of Michael Perry did not bring the closure she might have hoped for. While many believed that justice had been served, Lisa expressed that no legal decision could erase the grief and emptiness left behind. The pain of losing her mother and brother could not be replaced by the outcome of the trial. While the sentence may have offered some sense of resolution for others, for Lisa, the void in her life remained. In contrast, Jason Burkett's sentence to life in prison without the possibility of parole sparked its own set of questions. Was it too lenient, given the seriousness of the crime? Some felt the sentence was too soft, given that he had taken part in the deaths of 3 people, while others believed that his troubled past should have a bearing on his fate. The question of juvenile justice, whether young offenders like Jason should be treated differently from adults, has never been more relevant. Werner Herzog's documentary Into the Abyss brought the case back into the public eye, offering a nuanced examination of Perry's final days and the moral implications of the death penalty. The film questioned whether executing someone who committed a crime at a young age was truly just, considering the long-term effects of trauma and the circumstances that led them to crime. Through interviews with those who were close to the case, the documentary explored the complex issues surrounding capital punishment and juvenile justice, offering insight into a system that often struggles to balance accountability with compassion. This case remains a powerful example of the struggles society faces when determining how to treat young offenders. Both Perry and Burkett were shaped by their environments, yet they faced drastically different consequences. Perry's death sentence and Burkett's life imprisonment sparked a broader debate about whether justice is truly blind to the circumstances that create such tragic situations. The long-term effects of the crime were felt not only by the families of the victims but also by the perpetrators. Michael Perry's execution was the end of a chapter, but the legacy of his actions and their consequences remain. Jason Burkett, while spared the death penalty, will spend the rest of his life reflecting on the choices he made that fateful night, as the consequences of his past and his actions unfold in a different way. The case of Michael Perry and Jason Burkett highlights the complexity of the human experience, with its mix of desperation, trauma, and choices. It forces us to consider the gray areas of justice, the influence of upbringing on behavior, and whether the justice system can ever truly be fair when such complex histories are involved. This case forces us to question not just the fate of these 2 young men but the way we handle cases involving youth and trauma. If you want to keep exploring real-life stories that challenge the limits of justice, don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for more gripping documentaries.